Hello there, my friend. I am really glad you found your way here tonight. Wherever you happen to be sitting right now, whatever kind of day you've just had, go ahead and get comfortable. Pull something soft over your shoulders if you have it nearby. We are about to slip quietly into another time together, and I would love for you to be as cozy as possible before we do. But first let me ask you something. What if the difference between being loved by a king and being cast aside forever came down to something as small as the shade of your skin or the shape of your eyebrows? What if a single portrait painted an ocean away was enough to nearly start a war of the heart? What if young women, some barely out of childhood, plucked out their own hairline strand by strand, just to look a little more pure, a little more perfect in the eyes of a court that was always watching? Beauty inside the walls of the Tudor court was never simple, and it was never just about looking lovely. It was currency. It was armour. And for some of the women you're about to meet, it was the very thing that helped seal their end. Now, before we step through that door together, I want to ask you for one small thing. If stories like this one feel like a warm blanket at the end of a long day, a like and a subscribe truly helps this little series keep going, and it costs you nothing but a second of your evening. And honestly, I would love to know you a bit better too. So if you have a moment, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are tucked in tonight and what time it happens to be on your clock right now. Are you winding down after a long heavy day, or are you already halfway into a dream? I look through every single comment and they make this whole thing feel a little less like talking to a screen and a little more like sitting with old friends in a quiet room. All right. Now let's set the scene properly. Turn the lights down low if you can. Maybe let a soft fan hum somewhere behind you. Get warm, get still, and when you're ready, my friend, let's go back. Picture England as somewhere in the early years of the 1500s. A young woman kneels before a small dim mirror made of polished metal rather than glass, because glass mirrors are still a rare luxury that only a handful of households can afford. Cold morning light slips in through a narrow window and lands pale and thin across her hands. Behind her, a maid works quietly, mixing a thick, pale paste inside a small dish. Her fingers slow and careful, almost reverent, as though she's preparing something sacred rather than something we now know was very, very dangerous. We will get to exactly what was inside that little dish later tonight, and I promise you, it is more shocking than you might expect. Somewhere behind her, a small fire struggles quietly against the cold stone walls, and outside most of the world is still asleep. There is no rushing here, no shortcuts, just patience, layer after layer, until the face looking back from that small metal mirror belongs a little less to a tired young woman and a little more to an idea of exactly what a proper lady of the court was supposed to look like. But right now in this quiet room, none of that matters yet. What matters is that this woman is not preparing for a ball. She's not preparing for a feast, and she's not even preparing for the man she loves. She's preparing for survival. Because in the world of the Tudor court, a woman's face was never just her face. It was a message repainted fresh every single morning, whether she liked it or not. A pale complexion whispered wealth and purity, and a kind of untouchable grace, all without a single word being spoken out loud. A perfectly arched brow could hint at obedience, at refinement, at the quiet, composed beauty that a king's court expected from the women around him. And the wrong look, the wrong shade, the wrong wrinkle appearing at exactly the wrong moment could cost a woman everything she had. Her place at court, her marriage, sometimes quite literally her life. Ambassadors from other countries would write long letters home describing exactly how a new bride looked, in careful, almost clinical detail, because those letters shaped whether a marriage alliance moved forward or quietly fell apart. A single, unflattering description sent across the sea in ink could end a match before the two people involved had even met face to face. Imagine your entire future being decided by someone else's opinion of your cheekbones, written down in a letter you would never even get to see for yourself. There was even a kind of quiet religious weight behind all of it. People of that era truly believed in a very serious way that a beautiful face on the outside was a small window into a pure soul on the inside, which meant if your skin was not pale enough or your features not delicate enough, some people were more than willing to whisper that your character must be lacking too. It was not fair, and it was almost never true, but it was the quiet, unspoken rule that shaped nearly every decision these women made about their own faces. Here is the part that always gets me every time I sit down with this story. This was not really about vanity at all. Underneath all of the paint and the powder and the plucking, this was about power and about who was allowed to have it. A woman's appearance could open the door to an entire kingdom, or it could quietly close it forever, and she rarely had much say in which one happened. Over the next several hours together, we're going to walk through this hidden, strange, and honestly kind of wild history, piece by piece. We'll talk about the pale, poisonous paint that queens wore across their faces every single day, never fully understanding what it was doing to them underneath. We will talk about the unsettling beauty ritual that pushed noblewomen to pluck their own hairline further and further back inch by inch, just to appear more angelic. We will talk about actual laws, real ones, written down and enforced that decided which colours a woman was even permitted to wear depending entirely on her family's rank. And near the end of our journey tonight, we'll talk about a queen who in the final chapter of her long life made it illegal for anyone to paint her looking anything less than eternally young. But before any of that can really make sense, we need to meet the women standing at the centre of it all. Some of their names you might already know, maybe from a history class you sat through half asleep, or maybe from a certain hit Broadway musical that turned all of their heartbreak into something you can hum along to. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, 6 wives, one restless king, and every single one of them judged, praised, or quietly discarded in part by how well she fit an impossible standard of beauty that, if we are honest, was never really about beauty at all. Let's start with the Queen. Most people tend to forget first. Catherine of Aragon sailed from Spain as a teenager dressed in the deep, structured fashions of her homeland, and almost the moment she stepped onto English soil, the court began comparing her quietly, endlessly to their own private idea of what a proper English queen should look like. She would spend years softening those foreign edges, adjusting, adapting, learning the unspoken rules of a world that was never built for her. And for a long while it worked. She became one of the most respected queens England had ever known, right up until the moment her husband decided he wanted someone else entirely. Then there is Anne Boleyn, the woman who by nearly every single beauty standard of her time should never have caught a king's eye at all. Dark hair in a court obsessed with gold. Dark sharp eyes in a court that prized softness. A quick clever tongue when quiet obedience was what was expected of her. Even one ambassador visiting the English court at the time wrote home that she was not by conventional standards the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. And yet somehow none of that mattered. She did not just catch Henry's attention, she held an entire kingdom hostage with it. There is also a strange and rather dramatic myth about her hands, one that history clung onto for centuries, even though it was almost certainly never true, and trust me, when we get to it later tonight, it is far stranger than you would ever guess. And then there is Jane Seymour, who almost feels like Anne's quiet opposite in every single way. Pale where Anne was striking, soft-spoken where Anne was sharp. Some historians have wondered over the years whether Jane's gentle, unassuming beauty was exactly the kind of relief Henry was looking for after everything Anne had put him through. Sometimes it seems the safest kind of beauty was the kind that never drew too much attention to itself at all. There is also Anne of Cleves, and honestly, her story might be my favourite one in this whole collection, because it involves a talented painter, one very consequential portrait, and a king who felt personally almost comically betrayed by a piece of art. I am not going to spoil it for you now. Just know that somewhere in tonight's story a single painting comes dangerously close to starting an international incident, and the woman at the centre of it walks away from the whole mess far better off than anyone expected. There is Catherine Howard, too, barely out of her teenage years when she became queen, admired for a kind of fresh youthful beauty that the court adored in the moment, and would ultimately have no mercy for later on. And there is Catherine Parr, the quiet reformer, more interested in books and ideas than in gowns and paint, who somehow managed to outlive a king that 4 other women could not. And then, of course, there is Elizabeth I, the queen who understood the power of image so completely, so precisely, that in the later years of her reign she quite literally banned unflattering portraits of herself from ever being shown in public. Just sit with that for a second. A world leader with enough authority to say officially on record, no, you may not show my people what I actually look like anymore. Near the very end of her reign, her officials were sent out with actual orders to track down and destroy paintings of her that made her look too old, too tired, too human. And if that does not sound like the most dramatic version of deleting an unflattering photo before anyone else can screenshot it, I honestly do not know what does. Funny enough, if Elizabeth had lived in our world instead of hers, I have a strong feeling she would have been remarkably talented with a filter. Here is the thing that quietly breaks my heart about all of this, though. Every single one of these women in her own strange and heartbreaking way was fighting a battle. So many of us are still fighting today, just in a much softer, much quieter form. The pressure to look a certain way, to meet a standard someone else invented long before you were even born, to be judged first by a mirror before anyone bothers to ask what is actually underneath. The only real difference between them and us is that for these women the stakes were not just uncomfortable or annoying or exhausting. They were quite often terrifyingly real. No filter could save you from a bout of smallpox in that world. No clever angle or soft lighting could talk a king out of an annulment. And yet, somehow, in the middle of all that pressure, these women still found small, quiet ways to be remembered for more than just their faces. Some of them, as we'll see tonight, used the very rules that were meant to box them in as a way to quietly outsmart everyone around them instead. So tonight let's go all the way back to where this entire obsession truly began. Not with the paint just yet, and not with the laws or the portraits either. Let's begin with the one thing every single woman at the Tudor court was told mattered more than almost anything else about her. The one colour she was expected to become no matter what it quietly cost her to get there. The colour white. Stay with that thought for just a moment, because it is going to take us somewhere far stranger than you might expect. Have you ever wondered why the words pale and wealthy ended up meaning almost the same thing in a world that never even used those words together on purpose? Here is the truth almost nobody explains properly. Being pale in Tudor England was never really about the colour of anyone's skin at all. It was about what that colour proved. Think about it this way for a second. If your face carried even the faintest hint of sun that told everyone around you something very specific, and not one bit of it was flattering by the standards of the time, it meant you spent your days outside, working the fields, hauling water, standing in the market from sunrise to sundown. It meant you did not have the luxury of staying indoors, tucked safely away from the weather, with servants to do the hard living for you. Paleness, then, was not really a beauty trait on its own. It was proof that somebody else was doing the sweating on your behalf. So women at court did not just wish for pale skin. They protected it almost the way you might protect something valuable enough to lock inside a drawer. There was even a small phrase people used at the time calling a fine lady's fingers her lily-white hands, as though the whiteness itself was a kind of achievement worth naming out loud. Meanwhile, a working woman's hands told an entirely different story, with no words needed at all. Cracked knuckles from cold water, sunspots across the back of her fingers, calluses that came from years of honest, exhausting labour. Nobody needed to ask what kind of life she lived. Her hands simply announced it for her, and here is a small detail I find quietly heartbreaking. Plenty of working women wanted that pale protected look too, of course they did, but they could never afford the real thing. So some of them improvised rubbing plain flour or chalk dust across their cheeks for a wedding, a fair, or a special church service, chasing a cheap temporary imitation of a look the wealthy got to wear every single day without even trying. Beauty even back then came with a price tag attached, and not everyone was working from the same budget. And this is where the story takes a turn that still catches people off guard whenever I tell it. Picture a noblewoman stepping outside for a short walk through the garden, or climbing into a coach for a trip across the countryside. Before she does, she reaches for something you would probably mistake at first glance for a small piece of Halloween decoration. An oval mask made of black velvet, smooth and slightly eerie, with two narrow slits cut for the eyes. She lifts it to her face, and here is the detail that always gets people. There were no straps, no ties around the back of the head. Instead, she would place a small glass bead, sometimes even a tiny button, on the inside of the mask, and hold it steady between her teeth, which meant for as long as that mask stayed on, she could not speak a single word. Historians call this a vizard mask, and it was not some rare oddity worn by one eccentric woman in one corner of England. It became so fashionable, so widely worn among aristocratic ladies, that by the 1570s, one visiting merchant from overseas wrote home in surprise, describing how ladies of high standing had started covering their faces with silk masks whenever they stepped outdoors purely to protect their beauty. Even Elizabeth I owned several of her own, kept a personal mask maker on her royal payroll, and was still being spotted wearing one while strolling through her garden decades later, well into her 60s. Can you imagine choosing silence, real, total silence, just to avoid picking up a little colour from the sun? And yet for these women that trade felt worth making, because the alternative, being mistaken for someone who worked outdoors for a living, was seen as a far greater loss. Not everyone approved of the trend, mind you. A few preachers of the time grumbled that a woman hiding behind a blank velvet face was somehow being dishonest, as though covering her skin from sunburn was one short step away from covering up her character too. Which honestly tells you a lot about how tightly a woman's face and a woman's morality were tangled together in people's minds back then, whether she wanted them tangled or not. But the mask, honestly, was one of the gentler solutions available to them. Some noble women, desperate for a paleness that nature had not given them, naturally turned to something considerably more dangerous. Physicians of the era were sometimes brought in specifically to draw a small amount of blood from a woman's arm. Not because she was unwell, but because a little blood loss left the skin looking whiter, softer, more delicate, at least for a short while afterward. Others tried to starve the colour right out of their own bodies, deliberately eating far less than they needed, simply because word had spread that an unsettled, empty stomach could leave a woman looking pale and fragile in exactly the way fashion demanded. I want to pause on that for a second because it deserves more than a passing mention. These were not isolated stories about one or two desperate women. This was a widespread, quietly accepted part of upper-class beauty culture treated the same way we might treat a trending diet today, except with a great deal more at stake for the body underneath. Please hear me clearly on this one. None of it was healthy, none of it was safe, and if anything, it is a sad little reminder that chasing an appearance someone else invented has rarely, if ever, been worth the cost to a person's actual well-being. It is worth remembering whenever history hands us a beauty trend that sounds almost glamorous on the surface, that there was very often a much harder, much lonelier reality sitting just beneath it. Part of why bleeding felt like reasonable medicine at all rather than something alarming comes down to how doctors of that era understood the body in the first place. Physicians believed a person's health depended on balancing 4 internal fluids inside them, and that too much blood could leave someone flushed, overheated, even a little too rosy in the cheeks for fashionable taste. So when a woman asked to be bled purely for the sake of her complexion, her physician did not see anything strange about the request at all. As far as medical science of the day was concerned, he was simply helping her find balance. We now know, of course, that he was doing nothing of the sort. Now let me bring you back to one particular queen, because her story shows exactly how personal, how frightening this obsession with a perfect complexion could actually become. In October of 1562, Elizabeth I fell suddenly dangerously ill at Hampton Court Palace. She was 29 years old, unmarried with no children, and absolutely no clear heir waiting behind her. At first, her fever seemed ordinary enough, the kind of thing anyone might shake off within a few days, and Elizabeth, stubborn as ever, brushed the whole thing off as nothing more than a passing cold. She kept working. She kept writing letters. She even took a bath at one point, hoping the warm water might ease the ache in her limbs and chase the fever away entirely. It did not. Word of the crisis spread through the palace corridors in whispers long before anyone dared say it out loud. Candles burned late in the privy chamber. Council members gathered in hushed groups outside her door, quietly debating what would happen to England if the worst came to pass, since Elizabeth had no husband, no child, and no named successor anyone could agree on. For a queen who commanded one of the most powerful courts in Europe, there was in that moment nothing anyone could do but wait and pray and watch a row of candles burn down through the night. Within days, small spots began appearing across her skin, and her doctors delivered a diagnosis nobody at court wanted to hear: smallpox, a disease that at the time took the lives of roughly 3 out of every 10 people who caught it, and left many of the survivors permanently marked for the rest of their lives. As the illness worsened, Elizabeth slipped in and out of consciousness so gravely ill that a German physician named Dr. Burkow, who'd reportedly been dismissed once already for delivering an unwelcome diagnosis, was urgently recalled to her bedside as a last resort. Nearby, her closest companion at court, a nobleman named Robert Dudley, waited anxiously for any sign of change, unwilling to leave her side for long. For several agonizing days, the entire government of England effectively held its breath. If Elizabeth died without an heir, the country risked sliding straight into civil war. And yet in the middle of that terrifying uncertainty, one of Elizabeth's very first fears, once the worst of the sickness had passed, was not about her kingdom at all. It was about her face. She reportedly asked to be wrapped from the neck down in strips of red fabric, an old treatment believed at the time to help prevent the worst of the scarring smallpox usually left behind. Whether that treatment truly worked is still debated by historians today, but what is not debated is how badly Elizabeth wanted it to. Here is where the story becomes properly fascinating, though, and just a little bit murky at the same time. Some of Elizabeth's own courtiers later wrote that she emerged from her illness with hardly a mark on her face at all, almost unbelievably fortunate compared to so many others who suffered through the very same disease. Other accounts from that same period describe the opposite, a queen left visibly scarred and desperate to hide it. The truth honestly sits somewhere in that uncertain space between the two versions, and we may never know for certain which one is closer to reality. What we do know is this. Elizabeth was not the only person in that sick room who paid a price. Her close friend and lady-in-waiting, Mary Sidney, nursed the Queen through the very worst of her illness, staying by her side through the fever, the blisters, and the fear, and caught smallpox herself in the process. Mary survived, but she was left with severe lasting scars so noticeable that she largely withdrew from public court life afterward, unwilling to be seen the way she now looked. Elizabeth never forgot that sacrifice, and by most accounts found it painfully difficult to look her old friend in the eye afterward, a small quiet piece of guilt that no amount of royal power could ever fully undo. Isn't it strange when you sit with it, how one single illness could leave two very different women with two very different fates? One queen whose face an entire kingdom depended on, and one loyal friend whose face nobody outside that sick room would ever think to worry about at all. Years later, long after that frightening autumn had passed, Elizabeth stood before her own parliament and said something that has always stayed with me. She told the room in her own words that rulers like herself lived permanently on display, watched constantly by the world around them, every small flaw noticed the instant it appeared, the way a single stain might jump out on an otherwise spotless piece of clothing. She understood long before any of us had a proper word for it, exactly what it felt like to live under constant, unblinking observation with almost no room left for an off day. That pressure never really left her. If anything, it only grew heavier with time and shaped nearly every choice she made about her own appearance for the rest of her reign, something we are absolutely going to come back to later tonight. Because what she eventually did about it is honestly one of the boldest moves in this entire story. For now, though, I want you to sit with something simple. Every single beauty standard we have talked about so far, the paint hinted at earlier, the mask, the desperate hunger for paleness, all of it was really about one quiet thing underneath the surface: control. Control over how the world was allowed to see you in a time when a woman rarely had control over much else in her own life. And here is a strange little twist worth sitting with before we move on. These days, plenty of people spend real money chasing the exact opposite look, booking flights toward warmer climates, or lying under a lamp specifically designed to darken their skin, all in pursuit of a golden tan that supposedly signals rest, leisure, a life with room in it for vacations. 400 years ago, a tan meant almost the precise opposite. It meant you had no vacations at all. Fashion, it turns out, does not actually care what it is selling you so long as it stays just out of reach for most people chasing it. And believe it or not, skin was only the beginning. There was another part of the face these women reshaped just as aggressively and honestly. Once you hear what it actually involved, the mask and the paleness might start to sound almost tame by comparison. It sat right at the very top of the face, and an entire generation of women were willing to pluck it away, strand by careful strand, sometimes even scarring the skin underneath on purpose, just to look a little closer to the ideal everyone around them expected. Let's go there next. Alright, let's talk about the forehead for a moment, because what happened up there is stranger than almost anything we have covered tonight so far, and that is honestly saying something. Take a good look at almost any portrait from this period. Ladies of the court, young princesses, even brides barely out of their teenage years, and you will notice something slightly unusual before you even consciously register it. Their foreheads look impossibly tall, smooth, pale, and rounded, stretching much farther back than a forehead naturally should, all the way from the eyebrows toward a hairline that seems to have quietly retreated somewhere out of frame. For a long time, people assumed painters were simply flattering their subjects, softening proportions, the same way a photograph might get touched up before anyone posts it online today. As it turns out, the painters were not exaggerating a single thing. That was simply what these women looked like because they had spent hours making themselves look that way entirely on purpose. This particular obsession did not actually begin with the Tudors. It had been quietly building for well over a century before Henry ever sat on the throne, starting somewhere in the courts of late medieval Europe, then drifting steadily across borders the way fashion trends always seem to carried by travelling merchants, royal marriages and portraits sent from one country to another as a kind of visual gossip. By the time it reached English soil and settled into the Tudor court, the towering hairless forehead had already been the reigning ideal of feminine beauty for generations. Grandmothers had done it, mothers had done it, and now, without anyone really questioning where the idea had even come from in the first place, daughters were expected to do it too. A high, wide forehead was considered one of the clearest signs of beauty a woman could possess, right alongside pale skin and fair hair. It suggested intelligence, refinement, a kind of delicate, almost otherworldly innocence that the era prized above nearly everything else. And if you were not naturally blessed with that kind of forehead, which, let's be honest, almost nobody actually is, you were simply expected to build one yourself. So women reached for tweezers and got to work, not just on a few stray eyebrow hairs the way we might before a big event today, but along the entire hairline itself, plucking strand after strand, at the very edge of their own scalp, pushing that boundary backwards sometimes by as much as 3 full inches. 3 inches. Sit with that number for a second, because if you have ever plucked even one stubborn eyebrow hair and flinched, you already have some idea of what 3 inches of hairline removed one strand at a time must have actually felt like. Once the plucking was finished, the skin itself needed attention too. Women would smooth raw egg white across the newly bared forehead and let it dry into a thin, tight film, believing it would firm the skin and give that whole stretch of forehead an even smoother, more porcelain-like finish once the paint went on over it. Between the plucking and the egg white alone, a single morning's preparation could easily eat up an hour before a woman had even reached for a single drop of colour. And keep in mind, none of that was optional maintenance reserved for special occasions. This was simply what an ordinary morning looked like day after day for a woman who intended to be seen in public at all. For some women, plucking alone was not considered permanent enough, or simply was not fast enough to keep up with fashion's demands. A number of accounts from the period describe women reaching for a blade instead of tweezers, carefully shaving sections of the hairline back, rather than pulling each strand individually, trading a slower, more tedious process for a quicker, riskier one. There are historical accounts describing an even harsher approach, where a small heated pin was pressed directly against the newly bare skin, deliberately damaging the hair follicle underneath, so that nothing would ever grow back in that spot again. I want to be honest with you here, because this is one of those details that is truly hard to sit with, so let me say it plainly instead. We're not talking about a passing discomfort. We're talking about women choosing real pain, sometimes permanent scarring, in pursuit of a look that was never actually theirs to define in the first place. And the part that unsettles me most is that none of this was treated as extreme at the time. It was simply quietly what beauty was believed to cost. Here is the detail that stops me every time I come back to this particular story. This was not only something grown women endured for the sake of marriage prospects or court favour. Young girls, some barely old enough to fully understand what beauty even meant, yet were guided into this same routine early, plucking their own hairlines back before they had even finished growing up, simply so they would already fit the mould by the time anyone important came looking for a future bride. Doesn't that land a little differently than the powder and the paint we talked about earlier tonight? There is something particularly heavy about a beauty standard that starts shaping a person before she's even old enough to understand what is happening to her or to say no to it. I think about that a lot, honestly. We tend to imagine childhood in this era as simple, maybe even a little sheltered by our standards. But for a young girl born into the right family, born into the right kind of expectations, beauty was never something that waited politely until she grew up. It started early, quietly in small rooms with small mirrors, long before she had any real say in the matter at all. Try to picture it for a moment gently, because I think it says more than any single fact could on its own. A mother sits her daughter down in front of a mirror, perhaps for the very first time, and shows her patiently, almost tenderly, exactly where along the hairline to begin. Her voice stays soft. Her hands move slowly, careful not to hurt more than necessary. To that mother, this is not cruelty. It is love actually delivered in the only language this particular world had taught her to speak. She's preparing her daughter for a future that will judge her instantly and often unfairly by the shape of her own forehead, and she would rather her daughter learn to bear a little pain now from a hand that loves her than face a lifetime of quiet rejection later from a world that never will. The eyebrows sitting beneath that towering forehead were held to just as strict a standard. Thin, barely there, arched into a shape so delicate it barely registered as an eyebrow at all. Some women plucked theirs into that careful narrow line and left it at that. Others went even further, removing their eyebrows completely, then painting a thinner, more fashionable pair back on using pigment, positioned wherever that particular year's trend happened to favour. Which means if you had walked through an English court sometime in the middle of this era, more than a few of the eyebrows staring back at you were not eyebrows at all. They were simply paint resting quietly on bare skin, exactly where a real eyebrow used to be. It is not hard to imagine the kind of raised eyebrows, no pun intended, that a woman might have earned at court, if someone got a little too close and noticed the truth for themselves. Even eyelashes were not left alone in all of this. Women would burn cloves down into a fine ash and gently work that ash into their lashes to darken them, or mix elderberry juice with a bit of tree sap for roughly the same effect. It sounds almost like a page pulled from an old apothecary's recipe book, and honestly, in a way, it more or less was. Beauty and medicine were never quite as separate back then as we like to imagine them being now. Even Elizabeth I, a queen with an empire's worth of resources at her fingertips, tended to this herself personally. Historical accounts describe her tweezing her own eyebrows throughout her life, quietly maintaining that high, clear forehead, long after she had the power to command an entire household of servants to do the plucking for her instead. There is something almost funny about that in a bittersweet sort of way. Even with all the power in the world sitting in her hands, some beauty rituals apparently still felt too personal to hand over to somebody else. Here is what I keep circling back to whenever I sit with this part of the story, and it is the piece that turns this from a strange historical fact into something a little more uncomfortable. The entire look these women worked so hard to build, the towering forehead, the barely their brows, the wide doll-like eyes, was designed to look completely natural, effortless, as though this was simply how a truly pure, untouched woman happened to look without a single hour of pain sitting behind it. Which means an enormous amount of very real suffering went into constructing an image whose entire purpose was to look like no suffering had gone into it at all. If that is not one of the oldest tricks beauty has ever played on any of us, I honestly do not know what is. And here is the part of this particular story that always leaves me a little thoughtful. This exact look, the one so many women spent their whole lives maintaining painfully quietly, one strand at a time, did not last forever. As the decades rolled on past the Tudor court, fashion slowly shifted again. Hairlines crept forward, fuller brows crept back into favour, and the towering forehead that had once defined feminine beauty for generation after generation quietly fell out of style the same way almost every beauty standard eventually does. All of that pain in the end chased a trend with an expiration date nobody at the time could have possibly seen coming. And before you feel too far removed from any of this, think about how many decades our own beauty trends have spent doing something remarkably similar with eyebrows of all things. Pencil-thin brows were the entire look in the 1920s. Thin, sharply arched brows made a comeback in the 1990s, plucked down to almost nothing all over again. Then the pendulum swung hard in the opposite direction, and suddenly bold, full, perfectly sculpted brows became the standard nearly everyone felt pressured to chase instead. Entire industries now exist purely to shape tint and reshape eyebrows into whatever look happens to be trending in a given year, sometimes with tools a good deal more permanent than a simple pair of tweezers ever were. We like to imagine we have moved well past this particular chapter of history, and yet plenty of us are still in our own quiet way, plucking away at ourselves in pursuit of somebody else's idea of what a face is supposed to look like. There is one more small piece of that puzzle worth sitting with before we move on, and it might be my favourite detail in this entire section of the story. All of this effort, the plucking, the painted brows, the darkened lashes, was rarely ever discussed openly. A lady of the court was expected to appear at breakfast looking effortlessly naturally beautiful, as though she had simply woken up that way. The actual process behind it, tweezers, ash eyes, stinging from the pain of it all, stayed firmly behind closed doors, hidden from anyone who might have questioned just how much work had truly gone into looking so undone. Which, if you think about it for even a moment, sounds rather familiar, does it not? Some version of that exact performance is still quietly happening behind plenty of closed doors today. So now picture our noblewoman one more time, forehead bare and perfectly rounded brows thinned carefully into place, lashes darkened just so. There is only one piece of this look still missing, and it happens to be the very thing we have circled back to more than once tonight without ever fully opening it up. That small dish of pale paste waiting quietly on the table beside her mirror, the one her maid was mixing so carefully at the very start of this story. It is finally time to find out exactly what was inside it, and why out of everything we have uncovered so far tonight what comes next might turn out to be the most dangerous chapter of all. Let's finally open that little dish we've circled back to more than once tonight, because what was inside it turns this entire story from strange into something far more serious. Picture that same maid from the very beginning of tonight's story standing quietly beside her lady, mixing together a thick pale paste inside a small dish. 2 simple ingredients, nothing more. A soft silvery white metal called lead ground down into a fine powder, and ordinary household vinegar stirred together until the mixture turned smooth and workable, almost like a kind of paint. Once it dried on the skin, it left behind a flawless porcelain white finish, unlike anything else available at the time. People of the era gave it a rather beautiful name, all things considered. They called it ceruse, and the finest version imported from Venice earned an even more poetic nickname among those who could afford it. They called it the spirits of Saturn. It sounds almost magical, doesn't it? A little bit like something out of an old fairy tale, a name that promises transformation rather than harm. And in a strange way, that is exactly the danger of this whole story. The most beautiful sounding things are not always the safest ones. This was not a small touch, reserved only for the face either. With fashionable necklines cut low across the chest, and sleeves that left the forearms bare, the same pale paste had to travel well past the jawline down across the throat, over the collarbone and along the arm, so that every visible inch of skin matched perfectly without a single seam or shift in tone to give the illusion away. A woman preparing for court was not simply painting a face that morning. She was painting an entire performance, every exposed patch of skin recruited into the same seamless, flawless picture. Here is what nobody standing in that room fully understood at the time. Lead is not a substance the human body was ever built to absorb, and once it settles into someone's system, it does not simply pass through and leave again. It stays. Layer after layer, application after application, it slowly accumulates in the blood, the bones, the soft tissue underneath the very skin it was meant to beautify. Doctors of the 16th century had no concept of any of this. They saw a fashionable white paste. They had no way of seeing what it was quietly doing underneath, and what it was doing we now understand with uncomfortable clarity. Prolonged exposure could cause hair to fall out in patches. It could make the skin underneath turn a strange ashen shade of grey, ironically the exact opposite of the fresh, healthy paleness a woman had been chasing in the first place. It could weaken muscles, damage the kidneys, and in some documented cases contribute directly to a slow, quiet death that nobody around her would have thought to connect back to a small dish on her dressing table. Have you ever used a beauty product without fully reading the ingredients list, just trusting that if it is sold to you, it must be safe? That instinct is not new. These women trusted the very same thing centuries before. Any of us were born and paid for that trust in a currency far heavier than money. True ceruse, the imported Venetian kind, was expensive enough that it stayed mostly within reach of the wealthiest women at court. Everyone else who still wanted that same pale finish, without the means to purchase it, mixed together their own cheaper versions at home instead, often using poppy oil, blended with finely ground animal bone or other similarly harsh household ingredients. It was not quite the same danger as pure white lead, but it was rarely gentle either, and it says something quietly telling about this entire era that even the so-called safer budget alternative still involved rubbing something rough and questionable across your face, simply to look like you belonged somewhere you were never quite invited. The paint itself was only half the picture though, because the lips and cheeks told their own separate, equally dangerous story. For that vivid, healthy flush of red on the lips and across the cheekbones, women reached for a mineral called cinnabar ground down into a fine, brilliant red pigment. It looked stunning against all that pale white skin, striking almost theatrical, exactly the kind of contrast Tudor beauty adored. Cinnabar, however, carried its own hidden secret. It is at its core a compound built around mercury, another heavy metal, every bit as unforgiving to the human body as lead. Where lead worked slowly on the muscles and the organs, mercury tended to aim somewhere even more personal. The mind itself, memory loss, sudden shifts in mood and temperament. In severe cases, a kind of quiet, creeping madness that nobody around the sufferer could have possibly traced back to a tube of lip colour. So think about what these women were actually doing to themselves every single morning without a shred of malice or carelessness behind it. Pale poison across the forehead and cheeks, bright poison across the lips, all of it applied by hand with real care in front of a mirror in pursuit of nothing more sinister than looking presentable enough to walk into a room. And here is the part of this story that truly turns my stomach a little, if I am being completely honest with you. This paint did not just sit harmlessly on top of the skin. Over time, it actively damaged the very surface it was covering, drying it out, irritating it, leaving behind exactly the kind of blemishes, dullness and uneven colour a woman most wanted to hide in the first place, which meant the solution to the problem was also quietly manufacturing more of the problem underneath it. So what did most women do faced with skin that looked worse? The longer they wore the paint, they simply applied another layer on top of the last one, and then another after that. Nobody at court, as far as history can tell, ever fully broke that cycle. If your skin looked patchy or grey, more paint. If your skin then looked worse the following week, even more paint again. Around and around it went each layer quietly, making the next one feel more necessary than the last. I do not think that makes any of these women foolish, and I want to say that plainly because it would be easy to look back from where we sit now and assume we simply would have known better. But put yourself in her position for a moment. Every mirror confirms the paint is working. Every compliment at court confirms the paint is working. The damage happening underneath the surface takes months, sometimes years, to fully reveal itself quietly and visibly, long after the immediate reward has already been collected in full. That kind of slow, delayed consequence is remarkably difficult for anybody to walk away from in any century, especially when everyone around her is doing the exact same thing and calling it perfectly normal. Elizabeth I, by most historical accounts, became one of the most extreme examples of exactly this pattern. In her later years, she reportedly wore her white paint continuously for weeks at a time, adding a fresh coat directly over the old one each morning rather than removing everything and starting clean. Which means by the end of any given stretch, her face was not wearing one thin layer of cerus at all. It was wearing weeks' worth of it, stacked one on top of another, thickening with every single day that passed. Eventually, of course, all of that built-up paint had to come off, and the method used to remove it was in its own way nearly as dangerous as the paint itself. Women scrubbed their faces clean using a mixture that often included crushed eggshells for texture alum to tighten and dry the skin, and in a detail that still catches people off guard every time I share it, an additional dose of mercury folded directly into the cleansing mixture as well. The very substance already quietly poisoning them was also somehow part of how they washed it away. Isn't that almost impossible to wrap your head around, poisoned by the paint? Then poisoned again in a slightly different form by the process meant to clean the poison off. Historians who study this period often note something quietly devastating about the aristocratic women who wore ceruse regularly across years, sometimes decades of their adult lives. Many of them, by multiple accounts, did not live to see their 50th year. Now, life in the 16th century carried plenty of separate dangers on its own disease, poor sanitation complications during childbirth, so no single cause explains every early death among these women. But when historians look specifically at the pattern of symptoms recorded among heavy ceruse users, hair loss, greying skin, muscle, weakness, memory changes, the fingerprints of long-term lead and mercury exposure are difficult to ignore. Here is something that might surprise you though, and it always quietly reframes this story for me whenever I come back to it. This particular tragedy did not begin with the Tudors, and it certainly did not end with them either. Archaeologists digging through graves belonging to wealthy women in ancient Greece have found the very same traces of white lead resting in their bones. So have researchers studying burial sites from the Shang dynasty in ancient China, a civilization that existed more than 3,000 years before Elizabeth I ever sat on a throne. Different centuries, different continents, different languages, religions and rulers entirely. And yet again and again the same quiet decision made independently by women who never knew of each other's existence, choosing a slow, invisible poison over the risk of simply being seen as less than beautiful. Doesn't that stop you for a second once you really sit with it? Women separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, who never spoke the same language, never worshipped the same gods, never even knew the others existed, somehow arriving at the exact same solution on their own entirely independently. That is not coincidence. That is just how powerful the pressure to look a certain way has always been in every corner of human history we have ever thought to dig into. That is not really a Tudor story anymore when you step back and look at it properly. That is a human story, one that keeps repeating itself in different costumes across thousands of years of our shared history. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. We tend to look back at these women and feel a kind of gentle pity, maybe even a little disbelief, as though surely we would know better today. And to a real extent, thankfully, we do. Modern cosmetics are regulated in ways 16th-century women could never have imagined. Tested, monitored, held to strict legal limits most of us never think twice about. And yet even now, testing agencies still occasionally detect faint traces of lead, lingering inside modern lipsticks, almost always at levels considered far too small to cause any real harm, carefully regulated down to fractions of a single part per million. Regulators consider it perfectly safe, and by every measure we currently have, it truly is nothing remotely close to the danger these Tudor women faced every single morning. But there is still something oddly poetic about it, isn't there? Even after everything we now know, even after everything these women's suffering eventually taught the rest of us, this one particular metal has never quite fully let go of the beauty industry. It first attached itself to centuries and centuries ago. Almost like a quiet echo that refuses to fade completely no matter how much time passes. Maybe that is the real lesson buried underneath all of this, more than any single fact about lead or mercury or ceruse. Beauty standards ask an enormous amount of the people trying to meet them, and history rarely bothers keeping score of what that pursuit actually costs behind closed doors. These women were not foolish, and they were not vain in any way worth judging harshly from where we are sitting now. They were doing exactly what every single one of us still quietly does in our own particular era, using whatever tools their world handed them to try to feel seen, valued, and safe inside a system that had already decided long before they were born exactly what safety was supposed to look like on a woman's face. Not every woman at this court, though, was willing to play by every single one of these rules. There was one queen in particular who broke nearly every standard we have talked about across this entire story so far dark, where the ideal demanded fair sharp, where the ideal demanded soft, and somehow against every single expectation of her era, she did not just survive that contradiction, she used it to capture the attention of an entire kingdom. Let's talk about her next, because her story might be the most fascinating twist this whole night has to offer. Now let's talk about the woman who, by every rule we have covered so far tonight, should never have stood a chance at any of this. A visiting ambassador from Venice, a nobleman named Mario Savorniano, wrote home not long after meeting her in person, and his account is still considered one of the most detailed descriptions we have of her from anyone who actually stood in the same room. He put it about as plainly as anyone from that era dared to. He noted more or less that she was not, by the conventional standards of the day, considered one of the great beauties of the court, and by the standards we have spent this entire evening walking through together, he was not exaggerating. Her hair was dark in a court that worshipped gold. Her complexion carried a warmer olive undertone in a court obsessed with porcelain white. Her features were sharp and striking rather than soft and doll-like in a court that had spent generations plucking and painting itself into exactly that kind of softness. On paper, this woman had absolutely none of the raw material this whole beauty system was built around, and yet somehow she did not just enter the English court quietly and hope to be overlooked. She walked in, and within a few short years she had rewritten the rules of the entire game, captured the singular attention of the most powerful man in England, and changed the course of an entire nation in the process. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and if you take away nothing else from this next part of our story, I hope you take this. Sometimes the most fascinating beauty story in a room has nothing to do with beauty at all. When Anne first returned to the English court, nobody was watching her particularly closely at all. She joined as one of many ladies in waiting quietly serving Queen Catherine of Aragon, the very same devoted wife we met earlier tonight, blending into a long line of well-dressed young women whose main job was simply to be present, decorative and agreeable. For a while that is more or less exactly what she was. One face among many standing slightly behind the throne rather than anywhere near it. That, of course, did not last. It is worth mentioning quietly that Anne was not actually the first Boleyn sister to catch the king's eye. Her sister Mary had already spent time as Henry's mistress before Anne ever properly entered the picture, by most accounts, a gentler, more conventionally agreeable presence at court than her younger sister would ever be. Mary played the role the court expected of a royal mistress, and once Henry's attention eventually moved on, so did she quietly without much resistance. Anne watched all of that unfold up close, and whether consciously or not, she seems to have decided early on that she was not interested in following that same script. So how exactly does a woman succeed in a world built entirely around a standard she did not meet? Let's slow down and actually sit with that question for a moment, because I think it matters. It certainly is not because Anne quietly ignored the rules and got lucky. It is because she understood something about charisma that most of her fair, pale, softly spoken rivals never quite figured out. A room does not remember the woman who blended in perfectly with everyone else's idea of beauty. A room remembers the one who felt like something entirely new. Contemporary accounts describe her eyes as her most striking feature, dark and unusually expressive. The kind of eyes, one observer wrote, could seemingly invite an entire conversation without a single word being spoken first. She danced with real skill. She played music beautifully. She had a quick, clever tongue that could hold its own in a room full of powerful men who were used to women simply nodding along in polite silence. None of that shows up in a portrait. None of that gets recorded the same way pale skin or fair hair does. But in a room in real time, in conversation, it apparently landed like nothing the English court had quite seen before. Have you ever met someone who was not necessarily the most conventionally attractive person in the room, and yet somehow you could not stop paying attention to them anyway? That is not a modern phenomenon. Anne Boleyn was doing this 500 years before any of us had a word like charisma to properly describe it. And here is where her story becomes something closer to strategy than simple luck. Once Henry's attention turned firmly toward her, Anne made a choice that very few women in her position would have dared to make. She refused to become his mistress, not out of shyness and not out of naivety about how these things typically worked at court. She held the line for years, deliberately patiently, insisting on marriage or nothing at all, even as Henry grew more and more consumed by the pursuit. That single decision, more than her eyes or her wit or her French fashion sense, is arguably what reshaped the religious and political landscape of an entire nation, since it was Henry's desperation to make her his wife that eventually pushed England toward breaking away from the Catholic Church entirely. Think about that for a moment. A woman the court considered less beautiful than her rivals ended up indirectly rewriting the religious identity of a country, simply by knowing exactly what she was worth and refusing to settle for less. Part of the reason she carried herself so differently traces back to where she actually grew up. As a young woman, Anne spent several formative years serving in the French royal court, immersed in a culture that valued wit-sharp conversation and elegant self-expression just as much as it valued a pretty face. She returned to England having absorbed an entirely different set of social instincts than the women who had spent their whole lives inside the more rigid, more conservative English court. She did not just look slightly foreign when she came home. She moved differently, she dressed differently, she spoke to people differently, and the English court, whether it wanted to admit it or not, found that difference absolutely magnetic. You can actually still trace this influence directly through something as small as a hood. For years, English noblewomen wore what was known as the gable hood, a stiff, boxy headdress shaped a little like the peaked roof of a house, covering the hair almost completely, and framing the face in sharp, severe angles. It was modest. It was traditional. It was frankly not particularly flattering by most accounts. Anne, fresh from years in France, favoured a very different style. Instead, a softer rounded French hood that sat further back on the head and allowed a soft frame of hair to show at the front. It was considered daring at the time, a small quiet act of fashion rebellion against everything the English court considered proper. And it caught on. Ladies across the court began adopting the same style, drawn to the softer silhouette and to the woman wearing it with such effortless confidence. Here is the detail I personally find almost impossible to look away from once you learn it. Years later, after everything eventually fell apart for Anne, the next queen who followed her, a quieter, gentler woman named Jane Seymour, specifically banned her own ladies in waiting from wearing the French hood at court. Historians largely agree this was not really about fashion preference at all. It was a message deliberate and unmistakable, a quiet way of saying that whatever Anne Boleyn had represented that particular chapter of the English court was firmly officially closed. Isn't it strange when you think about it how a piece of fabric worn on someone's head could carry that much political weight? A hood was never just a hood in this story. It was a statement about exactly which version of womanhood the court was willing to celebrate and which version it wanted quietly erased. Now, I want to be honest with you about something because I think it is important, and because it would be a little too tidy to leave it out. Anne's story does not end well, and I am not going to pretend otherwise tonight. Her marriage, her rise, and eventually her fall were shaped far more by politics, by the desperate pressure to produce a male heir, and by the shifting alliances of a dangerous royal court, than by anything to do with how she actually looked. Beauty did not save her, but it is worth remembering that beauty in the traditional sense was never really the thing that carried her to power in the first place either. Something else did that. Something harder to paint, harder to pluck into place, and in the end, apparently harder for a jealous court to forgive. There is a small detail from her final day that has always stayed with me, quiet and almost painfully human, in the middle of everything else swirling around it. According to the people who were actually present that morning when the moment finally came, Anne removed her own hood before anything else happened, and multiple witnesses specifically noted that it was made in the English style, not the French fashion she had made so famous throughout her years at court. Historians still debate exactly what that choice meant, if it meant anything deliberate at all, but I find myself drawn to the idea that maybe in her very last quiet moment of control over her own image, she chose to be remembered simply as an Englishwoman, nothing more, nothing performed, nothing borrowed from anywhere else. We will come back to a few more strange dramatic details about the rumours that followed Anne even after her death a little later tonight, because there is a particular myth about her that history clung to for centuries, and it is far stranger than anything we have touched on so far. For now, though, I want to leave her story sitting exactly where it belongs. Not as a footnote about a woman who was not pretty enough by the rules of her time, but as proof that an entire kingdom can fall in love with someone who refuses to follow the rules at all. And honestly, does that not sound a little familiar even now? Think about how many people you can probably name today who are not conventionally beautiful by whatever narrow standard happens to be trending this year, and yet the whole room still turns when they walk in. Maybe it is a co-worker who lights up every meeting the second they start talking. Maybe it is a friend who somehow becomes the centre of every gathering without ever trying particularly hard. We still do not really have a tidy word for it either 500 years later. We just call it presence or charisma or that certain something, and we still cannot fully explain why some people have it and most people do not. Anne Boleyn had it in a court that had spent generations trying to manufacture beauty out of paint-plucked hairlines and poisonous white paste. She never needed any of that machinery at all. She simply walked in and made everyone else's careful, painstaking effort look a little beside the point. Who does that remind you of in your own life? If you sit with a question for a second, I would honestly love to know, because I think almost everyone has met at least one person like that. Someone who broke every rule about what they were supposed to look like and somehow won the room anyway. There was one other queen, though, who found herself judged just as harshly by this same beauty-obsessed court, except her story unfolds in almost the exact opposite direction. Instead of being underestimated in person, she was oversold before she ever arrived, all because of a single portrait painted by one of the most talented artists in Europe, sent across the sea to convince a king he was about to meet the love of his life. He was in for a surprise, and so in a way was she. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second before we go any further tonight. What would you do if the only thing standing between you and marrying a total stranger was a single painting created by someone else, of a person you had never actually met? That is not a hypothetical question for our next queen. That is more or less exactly how her entire story began. By the late 1530s, Henry found himself in a deeply uncomfortable political position. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had died shortly after finally giving him the son he had spent years desperately hoping for, and with France and the Holy Roman Empire showing worrying signs of joining forces against England, his chief minister, a sharp, ambitious man named Thomas Cromwell, decided the king needed a fresh alliance and fast. His solution involved a duchy in what is now Western Germany, ruled by a powerful Protestant family and one particular unmarried daughter from that family who might just solve England's growing isolation problem in one single wedding. Her name was Anne, and she was the daughter of the Duke of Cleves. There was, however, one small complication standing in the way of this entire plan. Henry had never met her, not once, and in an age with no photographs, no video calls, absolutely no way to casually glance across an ocean and see what somebody actually looked like, there was really only one solution available to a king who insisted on knowing what he was signing up for before agreeing to marry a woman sight unseen. He sent a painter, not just any painter either. Henry dispatched Hans Holbein, quite possibly the most gifted court artist working anywhere in Europe at the time, all the way to Cleves, with strict instructions to paint Anne exactly as she truly appeared. No exaggeration, no flattery. Henry had been burned before by second-hand descriptions that turned out to be wildly generous, and this time he wanted the unfiltered truth delivered in oil paint. Think about that arrangement for a moment, because it is honestly not so different from something plenty of us do today, without thinking twice about it. A single, carefully composed image sent ahead of an actual meeting used to decide whether somebody is worth pursuing at all. We just call it a dating profile now instead of a royal commission. Holbein travelled to Cleves, spent time observing Anne in person, and eventually produced a portrait that has survived all the way to today, now hanging quietly in a museum in Paris. And here is where the popular version of this story tends to get things badly wrong, so let's set the record straight properly. English officials who saw Anne with their own eyes before the portrait was even finished specifically reported back that Holbein had captured her likeness with real accuracy, describing his work as vivid and true to life. Nobody who actually witnessed both the woman and the painting side by side accused Holbein of exaggerating her beauty even slightly. Henry viewed the finished portrait, felt reassured enough by what he saw, and gave his approval for the marriage to proceed. Here is a detail worth pausing on, one that most retellings of this story tend to skip entirely. That very portrait still exists today, hanging in the Louvre in Paris, and in recent years conservators carefully cleaned away centuries of accumulated grime and old varnish that had quietly dulled the painting over time. What emerged underneath was considerably more vivid and striking than the muted, slightly flat image most people picture when they think of Anne of Cleves. Rich reds and golds, delicate jewellery, a composed, dignified young woman gazing directly out at the viewer. In other words, the very evidence people love to point to as proof Holbein somehow tricked a king had literally been sitting under a layer of dust and old varnish for centuries, quietly waiting to prove the opposite. So here is where this story should by all rights end quietly and happily. A king approves a portrait. A wedding gets arranged. Everyone lives out the rest of this particular chapter in peaceful, well-documented harmony. It did not happen that way at all. Picture the scene properly because it deserves a moment of real attention. On New Year's Day in the year 1540, Anne had just arrived in England, staying near Rochester, ahead of the formal wedding festivities still to come. Outside her window, a crowd had gathered for an afternoon of bull baiting, a rough, noisy form of entertainment that was at the time considered perfectly ordinary public amusement. Anne stood watching the spectacle unfold below, still adjusting to a country whose language she barely understood when the door to her chamber suddenly opened. Henry, in a move he apparently considered wildly romantic, decided to surprise her by dressing in disguise and appearing unannounced in her chambers, fully expecting his soon-to-be wife to recognise the King of England through his costume, and swoon appropriately on the spot the way storybook romances of the era were supposed to unfold. Anne quite reasonably had absolutely no idea who this strange unfamiliar man suddenly standing in her room actually was. She'd never met Henry. She didn't speak English. Nobody had warned her that foreign kings sometimes enjoyed showing up in disguise as a romantic gesture. So she did the perfectly sensible thing any stranger would do in that exact situation. She looked at him politely, remained composed, and largely ignored him, her attention drawn instead toward the bull baiting taking place outside her window at the time. Henry was by every surviving account deeply personally wounded. He left the room changed into more recognisably royal attire, and returned properly, at which point Anne, realising her mistake, tried to correct course. But the damage to Henry's fragile pride was already done. He later complained bitterly that she was, in his own words, nowhere near as attractive as he'd been led to believe, a complaint that historians studying the timeline closely have noticed, conveniently arrived only after this particular protocol disaster and not one moment before it. Isn't that a fascinating detail to sit with for a second? The complaint about her looks did not surface the instant Henry first laid eyes on her. It surfaced only after his ego had already been thoroughly bruised by an entirely unrelated misunderstanding involving a costume and some bull baiting. Now, if you have ever heard this story told before tonight, there is a decent chance you have also heard the nickname history eventually attached to Anne, an unflattering comparison to a farm animal that gets repeated constantly in casual retellings of this exact moment. I want to be truly careful here because this is a case where popular memory and actual historical evidence have drifted quite far apart from each other. That particular insult does not appear in a single document letter or account written anywhere close to 1540. The very first time it shows up in writing is in a book published in 1679, nearly 140 years after Anne and Henry ever met, penned by a bishop who almost certainly never witnessed any of this firsthand. In other words, the single most famous insult attached to this entire story was invented well over a century later by someone with no direct knowledge of the events at all, and it has been repeated so often since that most people simply assume it must be true. Doesn't that make you wonder how many other historical reputations we take for granted might have been quietly rewritten the exact same way? long after anyone who actually knew the truth had already passed on. So if it was not really about her face, what was actually going on underneath all of this? Historians point to something far less dramatic than a failed romance, and far more tangled up in culture and protocol instead. Anne had grown up wearing the heavier, more structured fashions typical of Cleves and the surrounding Low Countries round skirts and layered fabrics that simply did not flatter the figure the way English gowns of the period were cut to do. Her headdress looked nothing like the French hood or the English gable hood the court had grown accustomed to. She spoke no English at all, could not dance in the English style, and had been raised with a far more modest domestic education than the sophisticated, flirtatious court culture Henry was used to surrounding himself with. None of that made her unattractive. It made her unfamiliar in a court that, as we've spent this entire evening discovering together, was deeply, almost obsessively uncomfortable with anything that strayed from its own narrow definition of what belonged. The marriage went ahead regardless on the 6th of January 1540, because England still desperately needed that political alliance, whatever Henry privately felt about his new wife. It was never consummated, and by July of that same year the marriage had been formally annulled. Thomas Cromwell, the very man who had arranged the entire match in the first place, paid an especially steep price for its failure, losing the king's favour almost immediately, and losing his life not long after that. And here finally is the part of Anne's story that I personally find the most satisfying to tell. Rather than fighting the annulment or spiralling into disgrace the way you might expect, Anne handled the entire situation with remarkable composure. She quietly agreed to the arrangement, accepted a generous settlement of properties and income, and was given the rather wonderful new title of the King's beloved sister. She stayed in England for the rest of her life, comfortable, independent, and warmly regarded at court, largely left alone to live exactly as she pleased. While Henry moved on to 2 more wives after her, one of whom lost her life at the executioner's block barely 2 years later, Anne quietly outlived every single one of them, including Henry himself. Historians studying this period have taken to calling her the great survivor of this entire story, and honestly, once you know everything she navigated to get there, it feels like the only fitting title available. There is something almost funny in a satisfying sort of way about how this particular chapter actually resolves. The portrait that supposedly ruined everything turned out to be accurate all along. The insult everyone remembers turned out to be invented generations later. And the woman everyone assumed had lost in this story quietly ended up winning it instead, walking away with her freedom, her fortune, and her life fully intact, while the king who rejected her buried 2 more wives before his own death finally arrived. I think there is a real lesson tucked inside all of this if you are willing to sit with it for just a moment longer. We still do this today, don't we? We meet someone through a photograph or a profile or a carefully curated handful of images, build up an entire expectation in our heads before ever actually meeting them in person, and then feel oddly betrayed when reality does not perfectly match the picture we invented. We even have a word for the exaggerated version of this now, catfishing, as though the entire modern concept only exists because of dating applications and filtered profile pictures. Except more often than not, the picture was never really the problem in the first place. We were. Anne of Cleves simply happened to live in the one version of this story where the portrait was honest, and the person doing the imagining still could not handle what he actually got. There is one more myth left in this particular corner of the story, though, and it belongs not to Anne of Cleves at all, but to the very woman we spent time with earlier tonight, the one whose charm managed to outshine every single beauty standard her court tried to enforce on her. Because after she was gone, her enemies invented something about her body so strange, so specific, and so thoroughly untrue that it somehow survived for centuries afterward, whispered as fact by people who should have known better. Let's finally get into exactly what that rumour claimed and why it took modern science quite literally digging up the truth to finally put it to rest. Some rumours fade quietly with time. Others, for reasons that still puzzle historians today, seem to grow stronger the longer they are left alone. This next one belongs firmly in that second category, and it took nearly 500 years, along with a surprising amount of modern science, to finally start unravelling it properly. By the time Anne Boleyn was executed in the spring of 1536, her reputation at court had already been thoroughly destroyed by the political machine working against her. But the woman herself, whatever people thought of her personality or her politics, had never once been described by anyone who actually knew her as physically unusual in any way. That detail matters quite a lot for what happens next in this story. Almost 50 years after her death, a man named Nicholas Sander sat down to write a book. Sander was a devoted Catholic living in exile, deeply committed to seeing England return fully to the Catholic Church, and deeply hostile toward Elizabeth, the daughter Anne had left behind, who by that point was sitting comfortably on the English throne. In 1585, Sander published his account of the entire English split from Rome, and buried inside that book was a description of Anne Boleyn that would go on to shape her public image for centuries afterward. According to Sander, Anne had been tall with an oddly sallow complexion, a large unsightly growth beneath her chin that she supposedly hid beneath high collars, a noticeably projecting tooth, and most memorably of all, 6 fingers on one hand. Let that last detail sit with you for a moment, because it is the one that stuck. Sander did not stop at listing these supposed features either. He apparently felt the need to explain them away too, claiming Anne had deliberately started wearing high, concealing collars, specifically to hide that unsightly growth beneath her chin, and that fashionable ladies across the court copied the style without ever realizing the real reason behind it. It is a wonderfully tidy little story, the kind that ties a real historical detail. High necklines truly were fashionable at points during this era, to a completely invented cause, giving the whole fabrication just enough texture to feel believable to anyone who was not paying particularly close attention. Here is what almost nobody bothered asking at the time though, and what historians studying Sander's account have pointed out ever since. When Anne Boleyn was executed, Nicholas Sander was roughly 6 years old. He never met her. He never saw her in person, not even once at any point in her entire life. Every single detail in his description was second-hand, at best filtered through decades of politically motivated Catholic exile literature, specifically designed to paint Anne as something closer to a monster than a woman, because a monster conveniently made for a much more satisfying villain in the story Sander was trying to tell about how England had supposedly gone astray. And in the world we've spent this entire evening exploring together, that detail about deformity was never chosen by accident either. A body that strayed from what was considered normal was widely believed at the time to hint at something darker underneath a kind of visible warning sign from a suspicious universe. Sander was not simply describing Anne unkindly. He was quietly accusing her of something far more serious, using her own body as the evidence. So let's actually go looking for the truth here, the same way any good detective would, starting with the people who were actually in the room with her while she was alive. Remember that detailed account we spent time with earlier tonight, written by the Venetian ambassador, who observed Anne closely enough to describe her hair, her complexion, her eyes, and her general bearing with real precision. He never mentioned a 6th finger, not a single word about it. Neither did anyone at the French court, where Anne spent years of her early life surrounded by sophisticated, socially competitive women who would have had every reason to notice and likely gossip about any unusual physical trait among their peers. And here is a detail I find particularly convincing, honestly. Positions as a lady-in-waiting, whether at the French court or later at the English one, were fiercely competitive. Families fought hard to place their daughters in these roles, a visible physical abnormality in an era that viewed such things with genuine suspicion would almost certainly have kept Anne out of contention entirely, long before she ever caught a king's attention. In other words, the timeline simply does not add up. A woman with a supposedly obvious sixth finger somehow spent years surrounded by competitive, socially sharp observers across two separate royal courts, and not one single person, friend or rival, thought it worth writing down until a man who never met her decided it was useful nearly 50 years after her death. Have you ever noticed how the most dramatic version of a story tends to survive the longest regardless of how true it actually is? That is not really a modern internet phenomenon, as it turns out. It is just how rumours have always worked long before anyone had a screen to spread them on. What made Sanders' particular version so dangerous was simply the technology available to him. His book was printed, copied, translated, and distributed across Catholic Europe at a moment when the printing press was still a relatively new and remarkably powerful tool for shaping public opinion at scale. A whispered rumour in a single royal court might fade within a generation. A printed book reproduced in multiple languages and shelved in libraries across an entire continent does not fade nearly so easily. Sander was not just gossiping, he was in a very real sense publishing. Now here is where this story gets a truly fascinating scientific update, because for centuries this myth simply had nowhere solid to go. There was no body available to examine, no clear evidence either way, just Sanders' word repeated over and over by writers who found it too colourful to leave out. That changed in 1876 when workers carrying out renovations at the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the Tower of London uncovered remains believed to belong to Anne Boleyn, buried there since her execution centuries earlier. This was not some casual hasty peek either. Victorian England had developed a real appetite for careful historical investigation by this point, and the examination of the remains found beneath that chapel floor was conducted with considerable seriousness, cross-referenced against burial records and the layout of the chapel itself to identify which set of bones most likely belonged to which historical figure. A careful examination of the skeleton was conducted at the time, and the findings were in their own quiet way spectacular. The remains showed a woman of delicate frame with well-shaped hands and feet tapering fingers, and absolutely no sign of any extra digit anywhere. 5 fingers, just like everybody else. You would think that might have settled the matter for good, but old stories, once they take root in popular imagination, tend to be remarkably stubborn. The myth kept circulating anyway, tucked into casual conversation, half-remembered trivia, and the occasional dramatized retelling, largely because a woman with a sinister extra finger simply makes for a better story than a woman who looked by every available measure entirely ordinary. Which brings us to something happening quite recently, and I think it might be my favourite twist in this entire tale. A portrait of Anne Boleyn held at Hever Castle. Her childhood home in England has recently undergone detailed scientific analysis, including infrared scanning that lets researchers see beneath the visible surface of the paint itself. Tree ring dating placed the wooden panel at around 1583, making it one of the earliest scientifically confirmed portraits connected to Anne. And underneath the surface, researchers found something remarkable. The original composition appears to have been deliberately reworked by the artist to clearly display 5 full fingers on each of Anne's hands, positioned in a way that seems almost pointedly designed to put the 6-fingered rumour to rest visually for anyone who happened to look closely. Think about what that means for a moment. Someone working not long after Sanders' accusations had started spreading appears to have used a paintbrush as a quiet form of rebuttal, defending a dead woman's reputation, and by extension her daughter's legitimacy as queen, without ever needing to say a single word out loud. Sometimes the most powerful arguments in history were never written down at all. They were painted. This particular discovery only came to light very recently alongside a wider exhibition at Hever Castle, gathering more than 30 different historical likenesses of Anne together in one place for the very first time, specifically to examine how her image was shaped, distorted, and occasionally quietly defended across the centuries following her death. It is a strange thought, honestly, that new information about a woman executed nearly 500 years ago is still surfacing today, simply because our tools for looking closely at old paint have finally caught up to the questions we've always wanted to ask. Doesn't that completely flip the way you think about old portraits? We tend to imagine them as simple static records, a face captured once and left alone. But this one appears to have been part of an actual conversation, a quiet visual argument playing out across decades between a slanderous book and an anonymous artist who apparently was not willing to let that particular lie stand unanswered. I think there is something worth sitting with here beyond just the fascinating detective work of it all. Anne Boleyn left behind remarkably few reliable images from her actual lifetime. Most of the portraits we associate with her today were painted well after she died based on second-hand descriptions, artistic guesswork, or simply copied from other women's likenesses entirely. That absence of a clear, agreed-upon face left an open space in the historical record, and open spaces like that have a way of getting filled by whoever tells the loudest, most memorable story first. In Anne's case, that happened to be a hostile propagandist with an agenda and a 5-decade head start on anyone willing to correct him. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other women throughout history have had their bodies quietly rewritten after death by people who never actually knew them, simply because nobody powerful enough stepped in to say otherwise at the time? Here is the part of this whole story that I keep coming back to, though, and it feels like a fitting note to leave Anne's chapter on tonight. In life, she refused to be defined by a beauty standard that never suited her, and somehow won anyway. In death, her enemies tried a different tactic entirely, inventing a deformity to make her seem less than human, hoping that particular lie would define her forever instead. And yet, here we are 500 years later, still talking about her, still fascinated by her, while poor Nicholas Sander is remembered mostly as a footnote, mainly for having been wrong, that if you ask me might be the most satisfying kind of ending history has to offer. Now, if a woman's body could be quietly rewritten by rumour after her death, imagine what an entire government could accomplish while she was still very much alive simply by controlling what she was legally allowed to wear. Let's talk about that next, because the rules governing Tudor fashion were far stricter and far stranger than most people realise. Imagine getting arrested for wearing the wrong colour shirt to your own workplace, not fired, not gently corrected by a manager. Actually arrested, fined, and possibly locked away for a few months simply because the colour on your body did not match the rank written next to your name. That sounds almost like a joke, doesn't it? In Tudor England, it was the law. We've spent this entire evening talking about the things women did to their own bodies in pursuit of beauty, the paint, the plucking, the pale poison hidden in a small dish. But there was an entirely separate layer to this story that had nothing to do with willpower or vanity at all, and everything to do with what the government simply would not allow you to own in the first place. Before a Tudor woman could even attempt to look wealthy, refined, or fashionable, she first had to check whether the law actually permitted her to dress that way at all. These were called sumptuary laws, and if that phrase sounds a little dry and legal, trust me, the details underneath it are anything but boring. Let's start with a colour that mattered more than any other. Purple specifically, the deep, rich shade produced from an incredibly expensive dye, was reserved by law almost exclusively for the king and his closest immediate family, not dukes, not earls, not the wealthiest merchant in London, no matter how much gold he happened to have sitting in his coffers. Purple belonged to the crown, full stop, a tradition that actually reaches back thousands of years before the Tudors ever existed, all the way to ancient civilizations that extracted the dye from a particular type of sea snail in such painstakingly small quantities that it became quite literally worth more than its weight in silver. Producing even a single ounce of that dye reportedly required crushing thousands upon thousands of these small shellfish, one tiny gland at a time, filling entire workshops with a smell so overpowering that ancient writers complained about it for centuries. By the time it reached Tudor England, purple had been synonymous with royalty for so long that the association barely needed explaining anymore. Everyone simply understood. If you saw that colour, you were looking at power. Cloth of gold received almost the exact same treatment. Real cloth of gold was not simply dyed to look golden. It was woven with actual threads of gold pulled through the fabric itself, an eye-wateringly expensive process that put it firmly out of reach for anyone outside the highest circles of the nobility. And even then the law still drew careful lines around exactly how much of it a person was allowed to wear and where on their body it was permitted to appear. Have you ever gotten dressed for an important event and worried even for a second that you might be underdressed or overdressed for the room? Now imagine that same anxiety, except instead of risking an awkward glance from another guest, you were risking an actual fine or a stay in prison simply for guessing wrong about what your own social rank technically allowed you to put on your own body that morning. And this was not limited to fabric and fur alone either. Even something as specific as a woman's headdress fell under this same legal microscope. At one point, Henry restricted a particular fashionable style of hood decorated with gold pearls or precious stones to a very oddly specific category of woman, the wives of men who owned at least one horse. I promise you, I am not making that detail up. Somewhere in an actual English statute, a woman's right to wear a certain hood depended quite literally on her husband's stable. Henry took this seriously enough to make it one of the very first pieces of legislation passed after he became king, and he kept returning to the subject again and again throughout his reign, updating and tightening these rules across multiple separate acts of parliament. Sable fur was restricted to earls and above. Certain silks and velvets were carved up carefully by rank, some permitted only in linings, others only in specific parts of a garment like doublets or sleeves, and never as an entire outfit. Even something as small as the type of fur trimming a woman was allowed on her sleeve carried a legal weight most of us would find almost unimaginable today. The whole system worked almost like a ladder with a very specific rung assigned to nearly everyone. Dukes, marquises and earls sat near the very top, permitted the richest fabrics available outside the royal family itself. Viscounts and barons came next, allowed certain silks and velvets, but firmly denied the most luxurious cloth of gold reserved for the rank above them. Knights and their households occupied the next rung down, followed by gentlemen, then simply free citizens with a certain minimum income, and finally at the very bottom of this entire ladder, labourers and servants who were barred from silk, fine wool, and most decorative touches, altogether regardless of how much they might have managed to save. A person did not need to ask a single question to understand exactly where they stood in this world. Their own clothing had already answered it for them every single morning whether they liked it or not, and these rules were not simply suggestions politely posted somewhere and quietly ignored. There were people whose actual job was to walk through market streets and public gatherings, specifically checking whether anyone was dressed above their legal station. Historians refer to these officials as searchers, and they had real authority to stop someone question their rank and confiscate the offending garment on the spot if the answer did not add up. One particular case from the 1560s still survives in the historical record, and I have to say, it might be one of my favourite small strange details in this entire story. A man named Richard Walwayn was actually detained by authorities for wearing what officials at the time described rather dramatically as a monstrous and outrageous pair of hose. Historians studying the case now suspect his real offence may have been padding his calves to appear more shapely, chasing a fashionable silhouette that was quite simply not legally his to chase. A man arrested over the shape of his own legs. If that does not tell you how seriously this particular society took the politics of appearance, I honestly do not know what will. The penalties attached to all of this were not gentle either. Under one statute passed in the 1530s, violators could be fined for every single day they were caught wearing a forbidden garment, and a portion of that fine was actually paid out to whoever reported them in the first place. Think about what that means for a moment. Your neighbour, your rival, even a jealous acquaintance had a genuine financial incentive to notice exactly what you were wearing and report you the moment it looked a little too fine for your station. Fashion in this world was not just something to be judged silently behind someone's back. It could be quite literally profitable to turn a person in. By the later part of the century under Elizabeth, the penalties grew even steeper. One proclamation set the punishment at a substantial daily fine, alongside 3 full months in prison, and if you could not afford to pay, you simply stayed locked up until somebody found the money on your behalf. This was not a minor inconvenience reserved for the truly reckless. This was a real functioning system of financial and legal pressure built specifically to keep everyone visually locked into the exact rank they were born into. Here is the part of this that I think deserves a little extra attention tonight, especially after everything else we've talked about so far this evening. We've spent hours now walking through everything a woman was expected to do to her own body in pursuit of beauty, and every single one of those pursuits assumed quietly that she actually had the legal right to display the results once she achieved them. A merchant's wife could scrub her face pale, pluck her hairline back, and dress her hair as elegantly as any duchess in England, and none of it would matter in the slightest. The moment she stepped outside wearing a fabric or a colour, the law simply did not permit her to own. Beauty in this world was never just about effort. It was gated quite literally by birth, and reinforced with fines and prison sentences to make absolutely sure nobody quietly climbed past the line without permission. Doesn't that reframe everything we have talked about so far tonight just a little? All that suffering in front of a mirror, and for most women an entire legal system stood ready to punish them the instant their appearance actually started working too well. Have you ever worked hard towards something only to discover the rules were quietly stacked against you, succeeding past a certain point no matter what you did? That is essentially what this entire system amounted to for most Tudor women. Beauty was demanded of you relentlessly, constantly, as though it were purely a matter of effort and discipline. And yet the moment your effort actually started to pay off a little too visibly, the same society that demanded it in the first place was fully prepared to fine you, humiliate you, or lock you up for daring to look like you belonged somewhere you technically did not. We still play a quieter version of this game today if you think about it honestly. Nobody's going to arrest you for carrying the wrong handbag, obviously, but plenty of us still instinctively judge a person's status from a small embroidered logo, a particular shade of a very specific orange box, or a pair of shoes priced deliberately out of reach for most people who might want them. Entire brands have built their reputations on scarcity alone, deliberately limiting supply and inflating price not because the materials are especially rare, but because exclusivity itself is the actual product being sold. We simply outsourced the policing from the government to the price tag itself. The rule did not disappear. It just stopped needing a courtroom to enforce it. I want to leave you with one more thought before we move on because I think it is worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet. All of this, the searches, the informants, the fines, the imprisonment existed for one single purpose: to make absolutely certain that a glance across a crowded room could tell you everything you needed to know about a stranger instantly, without a single word being exchanged. In a world without photographs, without name tags, without any of the quick identifiers we take for granted, now clothing was the fastest form of communication available. And whoever controlled what you were allowed to wear controlled in a very real sense how quickly the world was permitted to understand exactly who you were. There is one more mark of status we've not touched on yet tonight, and it might be the strangest one of all because unlike a purple gown or a thread of gold, this particular symbol of wealth was hiding in plain sight every single time a person opened their mouth to smile. Let's talk about that next. Here's a version of beauty standards I doubt any of you saw coming tonight because it runs in the exact opposite direction of everything we consider attractive today. In Tudor England, if you wanted to prove to the entire room that you were wealthy, sophisticated and successful, one of the clearest ways to do it was to smile and let everyone see your rotting blackened teeth. I will let that sit there for a second because I know it sounds almost backwards. To understand how something so strange became fashionable, you first have to understand just how rare and expensive sugar actually was during this period. It was not sitting in a bowl on every kitchen table the way it is now. Sugar arrived in England through long, costly trade routes imported from places like Morocco, the Barbary Coast, and eventually the West Indies. And because of that difficulty, it functioned less like a basic ingredient and more like a luxury item, roughly the way we might think about rare spices, imported chocolate, or an expensive bottle of something special reserved only for the right occasion. Ordinary households sweetened their food with honey, instead a far more available option that, as it turns out, did considerably less damage to human teeth over a lifetime. There is a small irony worth mentioning here too before we go any further. Sugar was not originally introduced to England purely as an indulgence. Physicians of the era actually believed it carried genuine medicinal value, recommending it to soothe coughs, ease colds, and calm an unsettled stomach. So in a strange way, the very substance that would eventually rot the smiles off the wealthiest people in England first arrived in the country labelled quite sincerely as medicine. So here is the twist. Before sugar became fashionable among the English elite, dental health across most of the population, rich and poor alike, was actually reasonably good by historical standards. Archaeologists examining skeletal remains from earlier in this era, including remains connected to Anne Boleyn and to Henry's own sister Mary Tudor, have found remarkably healthy, well-preserved teeth. A small detail that quietly undercuts the popular assumption that everyone back then simply walked around with a mouthful of decay as a matter of course. That was not actually the natural baseline at all. It became the baseline for a very specific group of people, and only once one particular ingredient entered their daily lives in serious quantity. Once sugar started flowing steadily into wealthy English households, something rather unfortunate started happening to the mouths of the people eating it. Rich, elaborate sweets became a genuine status symbol at court, and elaborate feasts began featuring sugar sculptures, candied fruits, and sweetened delicacies specifically designed to display a household's wealth to visiting guests. At the grandest banquets, kitchens produced towering sugar and marzipan sculptures, known at the time as subtleties shaped into castles, animal ships and entire miniature scenes, brought out purely to be admired before being eaten or broken apart by the guests. One recorded feast from the early 1520s reportedly included sugar castles, model cathedrals, and tiny figures locked in mock combat, all crafted from a substance so precious that a single pound of it by the middle of the century cost roughly 1.5 times what a skilled tradesman earned in an entire day. Sugar was not simply a sweetener in this world. It was sculpture. It was jewellery. It was a way of eating your own wealth in front of your guests, one candied bite at a time. But sugar, as anyone with a modern dentist could confirm in about 5 seconds, is remarkably effective at rotting teeth over time. And the wealthier a family was, the more sugar they could afford to eat, and the worse, quite predictably, their teeth eventually became, which meant, for the first time in this entire story, wealth and physical decline were pointing in the exact same direction, instead of opposite ones. Have you ever noticed how status symbols sometimes end up costing people something far more valuable than the money spent to acquire them in the first place? This might be one of history's clearest examples. Black rotting teeth slowly became associated with privilege simply because only privileged people could afford to damage their own mouths quite this badly. Queen Elizabeth herself became something of a walking advertisement for this entire phenomenon, whether she intended to or not. She was famously fond of sweets throughout her life, and by the time she reached her later years, her teeth had visibly suffered for it. A German traveller named Paul Hentzner, visiting the English court and meeting the aging queen in person, left behind a detailed written description of her appearance at around 65 years old. He described a face that had grown long and pale with age, still handsome in its way, but marked clearly by the years, with small dark eyes and a nose that curved slightly downward toward the tip. Among the details he recorded, he specifically noted her teeth had turned black, and he attributed this directly to what he described as the English habit of consuming so much sugar. He was not being unkind or exaggerating for effect either. Multiple separate accounts from this same period confirm the same basic picture: a queen who had, i.e., quite literally eaten her way into visible permanent dental damage. And here is where the story takes a turn that I personally find almost painfully ironic. Elizabeth, by several historical accounts, attempted to care for her teeth, using a mixture of honey and sugar paste rubbed directly onto her teeth, and gums using either her fingers or a small cloth, which means in her attempt to maintain her own dental hygiene, she was essentially applying more of the exact substance that had caused the damage in the first place day after day, without any real alternative available to her. There was no toothpaste as we understand it today, no fluoride, no dentist offering better advice. Just an entire society working with the tools it had, even when those tools were quietly making the underlying problem worse. Toward the end of her life, Elizabeth had lost enough teeth that she reportedly relied on some form of false replacement to maintain her appearance in public, a detail that connects her in a strange, almost poetic way back to her own grandfather. Chroniclers writing about Henry VII decades earlier noted that he too had remarkably few teeth left by the end of his reign, suggesting this particular struggle may have run quietly through more than one generation of the same family. Now here is the detail that always truly surprises people when I tell them, so let's slow down and sit with it properly. Because black decaying teeth had become such a visible marker of wealth and status at court, some people who could not actually afford much sugar at all began deliberately blackening their own teeth to imitate the look. Think about that for a moment. An entire fashion built not around beauty in any traditional sense, but around visible bodily damage imitated on purpose by people hoping to appear more prosperous than they actually were. Have you ever exaggerated something small about your own life just to seem a little more successful than you actually felt at the time? Maybe not your teeth, obviously, But the instinct underneath it is exactly the same one driving this entire strange trend. People have always found creative, occasionally uncomfortable ways to borrow the appearance of a status they had not actually earned yet. Doesn't that remind you a little of everything else we've talked about tonight? The pale paint hiding a woman's natural colouring, the plucked hairline manufacturing an illusion of purity, now rotten teeth faked by people who could not afford the real decay their wealthier neighbours were unintentionally advertising. Status in this world was rarely about what actually made a person healthier, happier, or more comfortable. It was almost always about what could be performed convincingly enough for everyone else to notice. Meanwhile, ordinary working people, largely priced out of this entire strange competition, were left with considerably simpler tools for keeping their mouths clean and ended up quite by accident in noticeably better dental health for it. Chalk-crushed herbs and simple tooth powders were rubbed onto teeth using cloth or a fingertip. Twigs from rosemary or sage bushes were chewed to freshen breath and scrape away debris, a method that, however primitive it might sound to us now, actually did a reasonably effective job. There was no trend to chase no decay, to perform just a straightforward practical routine, born entirely out of necessity rather than fashion. I think there is something worth sitting with in that quiet contrast. The people with the least money in this story frequently ended up with the healthiest mouths, purely because nobody expected them to prove anything about their status through their teeth in the first place. Meanwhile, the people with every resource imaginable at their fingertips spent themselves quite literally into decay, one candied treat at a time, simply because their entire social world demanded they keep proving again and again that they could afford to. And if you want to feel a small, satisfying jolt of historical irony before we move on tonight, consider this. We have spent the last several centuries running in the exact opposite direction from everything Tudor England once considered fashionable. Bright white, perfectly straight teeth are now one of the most universally recognised markers of wealth and status, almost anywhere in the world, propped up by an entire industry built around whitening treatments, veneers, and painstakingly maintained dental care. Most people spend real money chasing every single year. Walk through any pharmacy today, and you will find an entire shelf dedicated to whitening strips, charcoal powders, and specialty toothpaste, all promising the exact opposite result Tudor sugar once delivered by accident. The specific marker flipped entirely black to white decay to preservation, yet the underlying instinct driving it has barely changed at all. We're still in a very real sense, using our teeth to quietly announce what we can afford. Funny how status has a way of circling right back around on itself, just wearing a completely different colour the second time through. There is one more piece of this puzzle we have not touched yet tonight, and it might surprise you just as much as everything we've already covered. Because for all the effort these women poured into their faces, their hairlines, and now, apparently their teeth, the actual act of washing their bodies was treated with a surprising amount of suspicion. Let's talk about that next. There is a myth about this entire period that I think we need to gently take apart before we go any further tonight, because it is one of the most repeated and, honestly, one of the most unfair misunderstandings about this whole era. You've probably heard some version of it before. Tudor people never bathed. They lived their entire lives caked in dirt, doused themselves in perfume, simply to mask the smell, and considered soap and water some kind of dangerous foreign luxury. It makes for a fun, slightly gross fact to repeat at a dinner party, and I will admit I used to believe a simplified version of it myself. But the real story underneath that myth is a good deal more thoughtful than most people give it credit for, and honestly, once you understand their logic, it starts to look less like carelessness and more like an entirely different, internally consistent system of cleanliness that simply worked on different rules than ours. Let's start with why full immersion bathing fell so far out of favour in the first place, because the reasoning truly made sense given what people believed about the human body at the time. Physicians of the era were fairly convinced that hot water opened up the pores of the skin, leaving the body vulnerable to whatever dangerous vapours or sicknesses happened to be floating through the air at that particular moment. In a world regularly interrupted by outbreaks of plague and other terrifying, poorly understood diseases, that was not a paranoid fantasy. It was a thoroughly reasonable protective response to a very real and very present danger. If you believed, as most people did, that illness travelled invisibly through bad air, then climbing into a warm bath and opening yourself up to that same air suddenly sounded less like relaxation and more like an unnecessary risk. Have you ever made a health decision based on the best information available to you at the time, only to have it look a little strange in hindsight once medicine moved on and understood things differently? That is essentially what we are looking at here. Not ignorance. Just an earlier chapter of the same ongoing story medicine has always been quietly writing and rewriting. So did people simply give up on cleanliness altogether? Not even close. It just moved somewhere else entirely. Queen Elizabeth herself is actually a wonderful example of how misunderstood this whole topic tends to be. She reportedly bathed around once a month by her own choice, which sounds shockingly infrequent to modern ears, but by the standards of her own era that actually placed her on the more frequent end of the spectrum, not the neglectful one. She had access to a private bath at Hampton Court whenever she wanted it, so infrequent bathing was never a matter of access or convenience. It was a deliberate health choice shaped entirely by the medical beliefs we just talked about. And here is a detail that tends to truly surprise people, especially given his rather unglamorous reputation in popular imagination. Henry, far from being the unwashed, greasy figure he sometimes gets reduced to in casual jokes, was reportedly rather obsessive about his own cleanliness. He had proper bathrooms installed at several of his palaces, complete with a real plumbing system capable of delivering both hot and cold water on demand, an extraordinary luxury for the period. Henry lived in genuine fear of illness for most of his adult life, and his personal hygiene routine reflected that fear directly. The king everyone imagines as loud, greasy, and a little unkempt was in his own daily habits closer to a health obsessive than a slob. So if bathing itself was treated with such caution, what actually kept people clean day to day? The answer sits in a place most of us would never think to look: their underwear. This is honestly one of my favourite details in this entire story, so let's slow down here for a moment. Tudor men and women wore a simple linen garment directly against their skin, underneath all of their heavier outer clothing, and this piece, more than any bar of soap or basin of water, was considered the true engine of personal hygiene. The belief was that clean linen actively drew sweat oils and impurities away from the body as the day went on, almost acting like a sponge pressed continuously against the skin. Cleanliness in this worldview was measured less by how recently you had washed your actual body, and more by how often you changed and laundered that inner layer of linen. And because appearance mattered just as much here as everywhere else in this story, a visibly bright, crisp white collar or cuff peeking out from beneath a gown became a small, quiet advertisement, announcing not just how clean your body supposedly was, but how disciplined and virtuous your entire character must be underneath it. Doesn't that connect beautifully to everything else we have spent tonight uncovering together? Once again in this world, the outside of a person was treated as a direct window into the inside. Even something as ordinary as a shirt collar was quietly doing the work of moral advertisement, and when linen truly did need proper washing, households did not simply rely on plain water either. A thick jelly-like substance known at the time as black soap, made by boiling animal fat together with a caustic mixture called lye, was widely available for purchase dark in colour and surprisingly effective at lifting grease and grime out of fabric. Even Henry's own royal laundress, a woman named Anne Harris, is recorded in the palace accounts of the time purchasing this very soap to keep the king's own linen properly clean. Soap making, in fact, had become such a reliable trade by this point that most households simply bought it, ready-made rather than labouring to produce their own batch at home. For the moments, water truly was not an option. Tudor households apparently relied on something historians now call dry bathing, which involved briskly rubbing the skin with a coarse linen cloth to physically lift dirt and sweat away without a drop of water involved. It sounds almost too simple to actually work, and for a long time plenty of modern historians assumed it was little more than a poor substitute for real washing. Then a historian named Ruth Goodman actually tried it herself, as part of a hands-on project living according to Tudor methods for an extended period, and found the technique considerably more effective than she expected going in. Sometimes the past deserves a little more credit than we're quick to give it. That does not mean people avoided water altogether either. Sponging the body down with clean water, sometimes scented with citrus peel or herbs like mint and sage, was a fairly common daily practice, particularly around the face, hands and other areas that needed regular attention. This water often carried a practical medicinal reputation too, since herbs like sage and mint were believed to carry health benefits well beyond simply smelling pleasant. Hair received its own quiet ritual too separate from anything we've discussed about pale skin or plucked hairlines earlier tonight. Without any real equivalent to modern shampoo, Tudor households relied heavily on daily combing, instead using combs carved from wood or bone partly to keep hair looking neat and partly to physically remove dirt, dandruff, and rather unglamorously lice, which were a fairly ordinary fact of life across every level of society, from servants all the way up to royalty. Herbal rinses made from lavender, rosemary or nettles helped freshen hair between these combing sessions, and scented oils kept it manageable underneath the heavy hoods and headdresses we spent time with earlier in our story tonight. It was in its own quiet way just as involved a routine as anything happening on the surface of the skin, simply aimed at a different part of the body entirely. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth mentioning because it explains why full bathhouses eventually fell out of fashion almost entirely by the later Tudor period. Public bathhouses, known at the time as stews, had actually been fairly common in cities like London for generations, offering warm water and steam to people across different social classes. Over time, though, these same bathhouses became increasingly associated with disease and quite frankly with prostitution, since more than a few of them doubled as something considerably less innocent than a simple wash. As that reputation spread, respectable households increasingly pulled away from public bathing altogether, retreating instead into the private linen-based hygiene we just talked about, conducted quietly and safely behind their own closed doors. I think there is something worth appreciating in all of this honestly, rather than simply laughing at it from a distance the way we so often do. This was not a society that had given up on being clean. It was a society working from a completely different but truly coherent theory of what cleanliness actually meant, built around the tools, the medical knowledge, and the very real fears available to them at the time. Judging them purely by our own modern standard of a daily shower feels a little like judging someone for not owning a smartphone in an era before electricity even existed. And before you feel too superior about all of this, consider how much modern skincare advice still quietly worries about the exact same fear, just dressed up in slightly more scientific language. How many of us have heard a dermatologist warn against washing your face too often, worried about stripping away natural oils and doing more harm than good? Entire skincare movements today build themselves around minimal washing, gentle cleansing, letting your skin's natural barrier do most of the work rather than scrubbing it away twice a day. We still, in our own quiet way, treat water with a small amount of suspicion sometimes. We just call it a skincare routine now instead of a fear of the plague. Would it surprise you to learn that 400 years from now someone might look back at one of our own trending health habits and find it just as strange as we currently find a monthly bath? I suspect it would not surprise me at all. There is one more secret hiding underneath all of those beautiful gowns we've talked about tonight, though, and this one has nothing to do with skin hair or hygiene at all. It has to do with the actual shape of a woman's body, and just how much engineering it took to build the silhouette this entire era considered ideal. Let's get into that next. Before we go any further, I want you to picture something most historical dramas get completely wrong, because the popular image most of us carry around in our heads about this particular piece of Tudor fashion is frankly more Victorian fiction than actual 16th century reality. You have probably seen the scene before in some costume drama or another. A woman gripping a bedpost, gasping for breath while someone yanks impossibly tight laces behind her, squeezing her waist down to some impossible doll-like measurement. It is dramatic, it is memorable, and it belongs to an entirely different century than the one we're actually exploring together tonight. The garment Tudor women actually wore underneath their gowns was known rather charmingly as a pair of bodies, stiffened with thin strips of whalebone, sometimes reeds, or a stiffened canvas called buckram, and constructed from layered fabric, often taffeta or fine linen. This garment was the true ancestor of what we now call a corset, and here is where I want to gently push back against the popular myth, because modern historians and skilled seamstresses who have actually recreated these garments using authentic period techniques report something rather different from the fainting, rib-crushing torture device pop culture loves to imagine. Properly fitted a pair of bodies from this era functioned less like a punishment and more like support, some describing the sensation as remarkably similar to a well-fitted supportive back brace, or even, according to a few modern reenactors, more comfortable across a long day than an underwire garment plenty of us willingly wear right now without giving it a second thought. Comfortable is a strong word for anything worn constantly across an entire waking day, but truly dangerous, crushing torture. It was not, at least not in the way we tend to picture it now. That particular image, the one with the fainting and the desperate gasping for air, actually belongs to a much later century, when fashion pushed lacing to genuine extremes that Tudor tailors would likely have found both impractical and more than a little alarming. Have you ever assumed something about the past was simply cruel or absurd only to discover, once you actually looked closely, that it made a surprising amount of practical sense once you understood the full picture? That happens more often in this particular corner of history than most people realize. Because here is the detail almost nobody mentions when this topic comes up. The pair of bodies was never really designed purely to torture a woman into a smaller waistline. Its real job was structural. Underneath those wide, elaborate gowns we've admired throughout tonight's story sat an enormous amount of heavy-layered fabric, and without a rigid foundation underneath to anchor and distribute all of that weight evenly, the entire outfit would have wrinkled, sagged, and become thoroughly uncomfortable to wear for any real length of time. The stiffened bodice essentially worked the same way scaffolding works on a construction site, invisible underneath the finished structure, but doing all of the quiet, unglamorous work required to keep everything else standing exactly where it belonged. And once you understand that, the rest of the silhouette suddenly starts making a great deal more sense too. Let's talk about the skirt, because honestly, this is where the true engineering marvel of this entire outfit really begins. Underneath those wide, elaborate gowns sat a structure called a farthingale, A hooped underskirt built from bent rope reeds or whalebone, specifically designed to hold the fabric of a skirt out and away from the body in a dramatic, deliberate shape. The earliest version, arriving from Spain, created a smooth cone-like silhouette. But by the later part of Elizabeth's reign, English fashion had shifted towards something considerably more dramatic. A wider drum-shaped structure historians now call the wheel farthingale, which pushed a woman's skirts outward at a sharp, almost architectural angle from the waist. Some contemporary observers at the time claimed these skirts could stretch as wide as 4.5 feet across. Historians still debate exactly how common that most extreme version truly was, but even a modest version of this silhouette required an extraordinary amount of engineering hidden beneath the surface. Picture that for a moment. An entire structure built from bone reed and rope worn quietly underneath a woman's clothing purely to make her presence in a room physically undeniably larger. Doesn't that reframe the whole idea of a beautiful gown a little? This was never simply fabric draped elegantly over a body. It was architecture built specifically to make a woman occupy more space in a room than her natural body alone ever could. And in a world where power quite literally took up physical room, whether through a throne, a title, or a procession, clearing a path through a crowded street, expanding a woman's presence outward, was never just decoration. It was a visible, wearable claim to importance. There is a particularly clever engineering trick tucked into all of this too, one that historians have only fully appreciated in recent years. The stiffened bodice we talked about earlier was often worn at a deliberate downward angle, pressing into the top of the farthingale from above and tilting the entire structure so it sat lower at the front and higher toward the back. The visual effect, whether by careful design or happy accident, elongated a woman's torso while making her legs appear shorter beneath all that fabric, an illusion clever enough that some fashion historians only worked out exactly how it was achieved by attempting to physically reconstruct the garments themselves centuries later. I have to admit there is something almost architectural I find deeply impressive about all of this, honestly. This was not simply an outfit assembled and forgotten about each morning. It was a carefully engineered system layer upon layer, each piece doing very specific, deliberate work, resulting in a final shape that had comparatively little to do with what any individual woman's body naturally looked like underneath it all. Which brings up an interesting question worth sitting with for a moment. If a gown this elaborate did most of the actual shaping work itself, structurally mechanically through bone and rope, and careful tailoring, how much pressure did that actually take off the woman wearing it compared to everything else we've discussed tonight? Unlike the pale paint slowly poisoning a woman from the outside in, or the pulled and burned hairline reshaping her forehead, one strand at a time, the farthingale and the stiffened bodice achieved their dramatic effect almost entirely through outside engineering. The clothing did the work. The body underneath, whatever its natural shape happened to be, simply needed to fit reasonably well inside the frame built around it. Getting dressed in all of this, by the way, was never something a woman managed alone. Layer after layer, laces, ties, and pins, an outfit. This complex required real assistance, usually from a lady-in-waiting or personal attendant working through the entire process, methodically, piece by piece, until everything sat correctly. Sitting down required real practice. Moving through a narrow doorway required real spatial awareness, since a skirt, built 4.5 feet wide, simply does not fit through a space designed for an ordinary human body. Entire rooms at court were arranged quite literally with these dimensions in mind: doorways, widened furniture, spaced generously apart chairs, built without restrictive arms that might otherwise crush a farthingale flat the moment someone attempted to sit down, an entire silent choreography surrounded simply existing inside one of these outfits for an ordinary day at court, and everyone around a woman dressed this way, servants, courtiers. Even the architecture of the palace itself quietly adjusted to make room for her. Queen Elizabeth's own wardrobe records, remarkably detailed and still studied by historians today, list a genuine variety of these garments by name across the years of her reign. Entries describe a pair of bodies made from black cloth, threaded with silver, another crafted from fine, soft leather, and yet another cut from black velvet and carefully lined with stiffened canvas. Reading through these old records almost feels like flipping through a very expensive, very specific inventory. Each entry, a small quiet clue about the sheer scale of construction hidden beneath every single gown she ever wore in public. I want to leave you with one thought before we move on tonight, because I think it connects everything we have talked about so far in a way worth sitting with. Notice how different this particular chapter feels compared to almost everything else in our story. The paint was dangerous. The hairline plucking was painful. Even the sugar, in its own strange way, quietly cost people their teeth. But the farthingale, the stiffened bodice, all of that elaborate architecture achieved its dramatic effect largely without demanding the same kind of bodily sacrifice. Sometimes power and presence really can be built from the outside in, without asking a person to break themselves apart to get there. We still do a version of this today if you think about it honestly. Shapewear-structured tailoring clothing specifically engineered to smooth lift and reshape a silhouette without a single diet or dangerous treatment involved. The tools have changed considerably. Spandex instead of whalebone elastic instead of rope, but the underlying idea has barely moved an inch. Have you ever put on a particular dress or a well-cut blazer and felt your entire posture change simply because of how the fabric held you? That is not just in your head. That is centuries of tailoring history working exactly the way it was always designed to work. Sometimes the easiest way to change how a body appears has never actually involved changing the body at all. It just involves building something clever enough around it. There is one queen left in this story we have not fully returned to yet tonight, and she happens to be the same woman standing quietly behind almost everything we have discussed so far, from the very first small dish of pale paste mixed at the beginning of our story all the way through hairlines, portraits, laws, sugar, and now gowns engineered like small buildings. She took every single lesson from this entire evening and used it to do something no queen before her had ever quite managed. She controlled not just how she looked in a single room, but how an entire nation would remember her face forever. Let's finish where this whole story truly belongs with her. Let's go back just for a moment to that small dim room we started this entire evening in. A young woman kneeling before a metal mirror, a maid mixing something pale and quiet inside a small dish. Cold morning light slipping through a narrow window. Do you remember how unsure we both were at the very beginning of tonight, exactly what that little dish actually contained, or why it seemed to matter so much? We know now, of course. We have spent this whole night finding out piece by piece, queen by queen. And there's no better way to close this story than by returning to the one woman who took every single lesson we've uncovered together tonight: the paint, the hairline, the portraits, the laws, the sugar, the architecture hidden beneath a gown, and pushed every one of them further than anybody who came before her ever dared. Elizabeth ruled England for nearly 45 years, and for almost the entire second half of that reign, she carried a burden none of the other women in tonight's story ever quite had to face in the same way. She had no husband, no child, no clearly named heir waiting in the wings, which meant as she aged quite naturally the way every single human being eventually does, that aging itself started to feel less like a private personal matter and more like a genuine threat to the stability of an entire nation. If her people began to see her as old, frail, or fading, what would stop them from wondering quite reasonably what exactly would happen to England the moment she was finally gone? So Elizabeth did something extraordinary. She simply decided that the version of her face the public was allowed to see would stop aging entirely, whether her actual body cooperated with that decision or not. Historians now refer to this as the mask of youth, and I want to walk you through exactly how deliberate, how carefully constructed this entire project truly was, because it goes so far beyond simple vanity that it starts to look like something closer to a genuine act of statecraft. Early in her reign, Elizabeth had already shown an unusual awareness of how powerful a controlled image could be. As far back as the 1560s, she moved to restrict unofficial portraits of herself from circulating freely at all, insisting that her likeness only be produced and shared under careful royal oversight. But it was later in her reign, as the years began quietly gathering on her face the way they gather on everyone's, that this policy sharpened into something far more absolute. Official portraits from this later period, produced by skilled court artists like the miniaturist Nicholas Hilliard, began following a strict standardized template. Smooth, pale, unwrinkled skin. A face frozen somewhere in an eternal middle distance between youth and age, technically believable, yet utterly disconnected from how many decades had actually passed. Painters were not simply flattering her a little, the way any portrait artist across history has occasionally softened a wrinkle or two for a paying client. They were working from an approved formula, repeated painting after painting, designed specifically to stop time in its tracks. Then, in the final years of her reign, Elizabeth's government took a step that still truly startles people whenever I describe it properly. Officials were instructed to actively track down portraits of the aging queen considered unflattering, unofficial, or simply too honest about how she truly looked and destroy them. A formal order went out instructing that no new portraits be produced at all until one single, fully approved image existed for every other artist to copy from going forward. In the meantime, any existing likeness judged too unflattering to be shown publicly was to be quietly removed from view. Her own Secretary of State reportedly complained around this same period that despite so many gifted painters attempting her portrait over the years, not one of them had ever managed to produce a result the court considered fully satisfactory. A quiet admission that the real challenge was never a lack of talent, but the sheer impossibility of the task being asked of them. Sit with that for a second, because I do not think it fully lands until you say it plainly. A world leader at the absolute height of her power used the machinery of her own government to hunt down and destroy paintings of her own face. Doesn't that reframe everything we have spent tonight discussing together? The pale paint, the plucked hairline, the poisonous little dish we opened earlier in our story, all of it suddenly looks less like an isolated obsession, and more like the earliest, most personal chapter of exactly this same instinct. Elizabeth did not invent the desire to control how a woman's face was perceived by the world around her. She simply took an instinct every single queen in tonight's story already understood instinctively and scaled it up until it became an actual function of government. Because underneath all of that careful ageless paint, the real Elizabeth was quite simply a human being growing older, the exact same way every person eventually does. We already know from earlier in our story tonight some of what that painted mask was quietly covering. The scars left from her brush with smallpox decades earlier. The blackened, failing teeth that came from a lifetime of sugar. Along with all of that, historians studying surviving accounts describe hair that had thinned considerably by her final years, tucked carefully beneath elaborate wigs styled to match the same eternal image her official portraits insisted on repeating. None of that reached the public eye, not through official channels at least. What reached the public eye instead was something closer to a myth given a human face. Consider the famous portrait created to celebrate England's victory over the Spanish naval fleet, painted when Elizabeth was already well into her 50s. In it she appears smooth-skinned, luminous, ageless, one hand resting confidently over a globe, fingers placed deliberately across the very shores of the newly claimed colony named in her own honour. Every inch of that painting was built to project permanent strength and an almost supernatural command over time itself. Nothing about it was designed to show you an actual 55-year-old woman standing in a room. It was designed to show you an idea that could never grow old, never grow tired, and never under any circumstance be allowed to die. One of her very last surviving portraits pushed this idea even further, wrapping her in symbolic embroidery. Mysterious eyes and ears stitched quietly into the fabric of her own gown, as though the painting itself wanted to remind viewers she saw and heard everything happening across her kingdom, even as an old woman well past 60. By this point in her reign, the mask was no longer simply hiding her age. It had become its own kind of language, quietly announcing that this queen remained watchful, capable, and firmly in control regardless of what the calendar actually said about her. Here is where this story takes a turn I find almost unbearably poetic, and it happens hundreds of years after Elizabeth herself passed away. In recent years, a modern artist created a striking piece specifically built to sit directly across from that same glorious, ageless portrait inside a museum gallery. Using detailed forensic data pulled from Elizabeth's actual death mask alongside careful analysis of her portraits and written descriptions left behind by people who saw her personally, researchers and artists worked together to construct a startlingly lifelike moving reconstruction of what the real elderly Elizabeth likely looked like underneath all that careful painted perfection. Sunken eyes, visible wrinkles, faint scarring across her skin, wisps of thin greying hair where her famous red curls once were. Positioned to face her own idealized portrait from across the room, this quiet, moving reconstruction became in its own strange way the very first time in centuries that the real woman and the myth she built were finally allowed to look directly at each other. I think about that image far more often than I probably should, honestly. Two versions of the exact same woman staring at one another across a quiet gallery room, one representing everything Elizabeth wanted her country to believe, the other representing everything she spent decades of careful, exhausting effort trying to keep hidden. There is one final detail I want to leave you with tonight because I think it closes this entire story more gently, more honestly than anything else we could end on. After Elizabeth passed away, a monument was built above her tomb, carved by a sculptor working from her actual death mask, rather than from any of her carefully approved portraits. And if you ever have the chance to see it in person, historians who have studied it closely note something rather moving about the face captured there. It looks for the first time in decades like an actual woman in her 60s, not a goddess, not an eternal ageless queen frozen in painted perfection, just a real person finally allowed in death to simply look like everyone else eventually does. Maybe that is the quiet, honest ending this whole story has been walking toward from the very beginning. Every single woman we spent tonight with the Queen, who defied every beauty standard placed in front of her, and won anyway, the Queen who survived a portrait scandal and outlived every rival who mocked her, the Queen whose reputation was quietly rewritten by rumour after her own death, and now finally the Queen who tried harder than any of them to stop time itself from ever touching her face at all. Every one of them was underneath the paint, the plucking, the poison, and the carefully engineered gowns simply a person. doing her very best to survive inside a world that judged her relentlessly by a mirror long before it ever bothered asking what was actually underneath. We have come a long way since that small quiet room we started with tonight, haven't we? A little dish of pale paste mixed carefully by candlelight, holding so much more inside it than any of us could have guessed at the very beginning. A hairline pulled back one strand at a time, a portrait that nearly started a war, a myth that took centuries and a surprising amount of modern science to finally set right. Laws written into the very colour of a gown, a smile that once measured wealth in decay rather than brightness, a bath avoided out of genuine reasonable fear, a silhouette built like a small careful building, and finally a mask so complete, so deliberately maintained that it took hundreds of years and one quiet gallery installation for the woman underneath it to finally be seen again. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight, and for staying all the way to the end of these women's stories. If any part of this journey kept you company through a quiet evening, or gave you something gentle to drift off thinking about, that honestly means more to me than you probably realize. Making these stories, researching every strange little detail, deciding which threads were worth pulling, and which quiet queens deserved a proper introduction, is honestly one of my favourite parts of my week, and having you here for it all the way to the very end is not something I take for granted. There are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told. Other queens, other courts, other quiet rooms, with their own small mysterious dishes waiting on a table. I would love for you to come back and sit with me again for the next one whenever it finds its way to you. For now, though, let the candle burn down. Let your eyes rest. Sleep well tonight, my friend. And I will see you soon.